Clint Eastwood was mocked by a Navy SEAL who said, "Come fight a real man." Only 8 witnessed it. Before moving forward with this story, let me know the city you are watching from. I would love to know from Clint Eastwood fans are watching it. Okay, let's begin. The bar smelled like old wood and cheap beer, and the kind of silence that comes right before something nobody forgets. It was a Tuesday night in Carmel, California. Honey, the kind of night where the fog rolls in off the ocean and makes everything feel like a dream. 8 people sat scattered around the dimly lit room. A bartender named Rosa, who had seen everything twice. A couple of old fishermen named Dwight and Sal, who came every Tuesday, like clockwork. A young woman named Penny, who was nursing her first glass of wine and waiting for someone who was never coming. A retired school teacher named Harold, who always sat in the corner with a crossword puzzle. A big man named Terrence, who drove trucks for a living and stopped here between hauls. A quiet artist named Mira, who sketched strangers without them knowing. And a Navy SEAL named Bryce Calloway, who had just come back from his 3rd deployment and had something dark and restless living behind his eyes. And then there was Clint Eastwood. He walked in the way he always walked into places, like he belonged there, and like he didn't care whether you thought so or not. He was in his 90s, but you would not know it by the way he carried himself. His back was straight, his eyes were clear and sharp like 2 chips of blue flint. He wore a plain jacket and jeans and no hat, and he sat down at the far end of the bar without making a fuss. Rosa recognized him immediately and gave a small nod. The kind you give to people who deserve respect without needing it announced. She poured him a drink without asking because she knew what he liked, and he thanked her quietly. And for a few minutes, everything in that bar was peaceful. Bryce Calloway had been watching from the moment Clint walked in. He had 3 empty glasses in front of him and a jaw set so tight it looked like it was carved from stone. He was a big man, over 6 feet, and built like something that had been hammered together rather than born, and he wore his pride like a second skin. He had done 3 tours. He had seen things that would make most people close their eyes forever. He had buried friends. He had carried brothers out of places that had no right to let anyone out alive. And somewhere in all of that pain and all of that loss, something had gone crooked inside him. Not broken, not yet, but crooked, like a bone that healed wrong. He looked at Clint the way some men look at things they want to tear down just to feel something. Nobody in that bar knew what was coming. Rosa was wiping down the counter. Dwight and Sal were arguing about whether a certain fishing spot was better in the morning or at noon. Penny was staring at the door. Harold was chewing on his pencil. Terrence was eating peanuts one at a time with slow mechanical focus. Mira was sketching something with her head low. Bryce pushed back his stool. It scraped against the floor loud enough to make everyone look up. He walked over to the end of the bar where Clint sat, and he stood there for a moment, just breathing. And then he said it, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, loud enough that Rosa stopped wiping, loud enough that even Penny looked away from the door for the first time all night. "You know," Bryce said, his voice like gravel being dragged across concrete, "I've spent 20 years watching people like you get worshipped. Action heroes, cowboys, tough guys who shoot blanks for a living." He leaned in a little closer. "Come fight a real man. I see how tough you really are." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. It pressed down on everyone in the room. Rosa's hand went still on the counter. Dwight's mouth stayed open mid-sentence. Sal set down his glass very carefully, like he was afraid of making any sound at all. Harold looked up from his crossword, and for the first time in years did not write a single letter. Terrence stopped chewing. Mira's pencil hovered above the page without touching it. Penny's eyes went wide. Clint Eastwood did not move. He sat with his drink in front of him, and he looked at the glass for just a moment, and then he turned his head slowly and looked at Bryce Calloway. And what happened in that look was something that none of those 8 people would ever fully be able to explain to anyone who asked them about it later. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was not amusement. It was something else entirely. Something older and quieter and far more powerful than any of those things. Clint set his glass down slowly and he turned on his stool so he was fully facing Bryce. And he said, in that voice that sounded like it came up from somewhere deep in the earth, "Sit down, son." 2 words, just 2 words. Bryce did not sit down. His jaw tightened further, if that was even possible. His hands curled at his sides. "That's what I thought," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly at the edges. Akira, the way voices do when a person is using anger to paper over something else. "You've got nothing. You're just a face. You're just a name. You're not real." Something shifted in Clint's expression then. If you were watching closely enough, and Mira was, because Mira was always watching closely enough, you would have seen it. It was not quite sadness, but it was near sadness. It was the look of a man who recognized something in another person that that person could not yet see in himself. "Shimei, sit down," Clint said again, and this time his voice was different. It was gentler. It was the kind of voice you use with someone who is standing too close to an edge. Bryce laughed. It was a short, harsh sound like a door slamming. "You want to tell me to calm down, like some old man in a movie? You don't know anything about what I've been through. You don't know anything about what it costs." His voice was rising now, and his eyes were doing something complicated. It like two different storms fighting for the same sky. "I watched my best friend die in a ditch in a country most people can't find on a map. I carried him. And his family doesn't even know the whole truth of how it happened, because the truth isn't something anyone gets to hear. You want to sit there with your whiskey and your legend and tell me to calm down?" The room stayed perfectly still. Rosa's eyes were shining. She did not move. She understood instinctively that moving right now would be like stepping into the middle of something sacred. Clint looked at Bryce for a long time, and then he did something nobody expected. He pulled out the stool next to him, and he patted it once, gently, and he said, "Tell me his name." Bryce blinked. His whole body was still coiled tight, but something in those 4 words had found a crack. "What?" "Your friend. Tell me his name." Nobody breathed. Bryce stood there for another moment, and you could see the war happening inside him. You could see the anger fighting with something raw and more honest underneath it. And then slowly, like a man who has been holding something incredibly heavy for too long and has finally simply run out of strength, he sat down on the stool. "Marcus," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "His name was Marcus." Clint nodded. "She would tell me about him." And that was when something in Bryce Calloway broke open. Not broke apart, broke open, like a shell that had gotten too tight and the thing inside had outgrown it. He talked. He talked in the way people talk when they have not talked in so long that the words come out unsteady at first, and then faster, and then in a rush that you cannot stop, even if you wanted to. He talked about Marcus. About how Marcus used to hum old country songs under his breath during the worst moments just to keep his own hands steady. How Marcus could find something funny in any situation, no matter how dark. How Marcus had a little girl back home named Daisy who was 4 years old and thought her daddy was a superhero, which he was. How the morning it happened, Marcus had been in the middle of a sentence about what kind of truck he was going to buy when he got home, and how the sentence never got finished. So how the sentence had been living inside Bryce's chest unfinished for 8 months. How he came home and everyone wanted to slap him on the back and call him a hero, and he felt like the biggest fraud in the world because he had come back and Marcus had not. Clint listened. He did not offer any words. He did not try to fix anything or say that he understood or explain that everything happens for a reason or any of the other things people say when they do not know what else to do. He just listened. And his listening was so complete and so steady that it became its own kind of shelter, like a good solid roof over a person's head in the middle of a storm. Rosa had stopped pretending to wipe the counter. She was just standing there with the cloth in her hand, and her eyes were wet, and she was not embarrassed about it. Dwight had reached over and put his hand on Sal's arm without knowing he was doing it. Harold had set down his pencil and was looking at the 2 men at the end of the bar, with an expression on his face like a man who has just remembered something important he had almost forgotten. Terrence was sitting very still, and his lips were pressed together and his eyes were pointed somewhere near the floor. Penny had turned completely away from the door, and she was watching with her wine glass forgotten in her hand. Mira had stopped sketching. She was just watching with her eyes large and dark. When Bryce finally stopped talking, there was a silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one before. The earlier silence had been the silence of shock and held breath. This was the silence of a room that had just witnessed something that mattered. Clint reached over and he put his hand briefly on Bryce's shoulder, and then he took it away. Marcus sounds like a man worth missing, he said. Bryce pressed the back of his hand against his eyes. His shoulders were shaking. I didn't mean to, he started, gesturing vaguely at nothing, at everything, at the whole last 20 minutes. I know, Clint said. I've been so angry. I don't even know who I'm angry at. I know that too. Bryce looked at him then, really looked at him, and whatever he was expecting to see was not what he found. He found no judgment. He found no performance of wisdom. He found a man who had lived a very long time and had watched a lot of the world and had somehow come out the other side of all of it with his decency intact. It was not an easy thing to look at straight on. I'm sorry, Bryce said. What I said earlier. That was wrong. That was ugly of me. Clint shook his head slightly. You were hurting. People hurt in loud ways sometimes. He paused. Nothing wrong with loud when there's that much inside. Rosa poured 2 fresh drinks without being asked, and she set them down softly, and she walked quietly to the other end of the bar and busied herself with something that did not need doing, because she was the kind of person who understood when to give people room. Bryce wrapped both hands around his glass and stared into it. I keep thinking about Daisy, he said. His little girl. She's going to grow up and ask about her dad someday. She's going to ask what kind of man he was. And the only person who can answer that with any truth is me. And I haven't been able to do it yet. I haven't been able to face her mom. I've been hiding, running away in the worst direction. He glanced sideways at Clint, walking into a bar and picking fights with old legends. The corner of Clint's mouth moved just slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough. Not your worst decision? Something changed in Bryce's face. It was a small thing, and a very small easing, like the first moment when a storm starts turning, and you can feel the difference in the air before you can see it in the sky. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. He would have laughed at me tonight, he said. Marcus. He would have looked at the whole scene and then looked at me and said, Bryce, you absolute idiot. A sound came out of Bryce then that was half laugh and half something else, and it was the most human sound in the room. Then go be his voice, Clint said quietly. Go tell his daughter what kind of man her father was. Not when you're ready. You'll wait forever to be ready. Go before you're ready. Bryce turned that over in silence. The bar had gone very soft around them. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows. Inside, everything felt close and warm and necessary. Mira looked down at her sketchbook, and for a moment she considered what she had been drawing without realizing it. She had drawn the 2 of them at the bar, the old man and the soldier, and somehow, without meaning to, she had captured something in the lines that she could not have planned. The soldier was leaning forward, and the old man was leaning just slightly toward him, and the space between them on the page looked like the most important space she had ever drawn. Harold had not touched his crossword for a long time. He was thinking about his son, who he had not called in 2 years, over something so small and so stupid that he could no longer even remember what it was, only that it had felt very big at the time. And now, sitting in this bar, watching this stranger crack open and this old man hold steady, Harold decided very quietly and with complete certainty that he was going to call his son in the morning. Terrence was thinking about his own best friend from his early years, a man named Bobby who died in a car accident when they were both 22, and who Terrence had never properly mourned because he had been too busy being young and pretending that grief was for other people. He was feeling it now, right here in this bar, 30 years later, and it was strange, but it was also something like relief. Penny was still watching the door, but she was watching it differently now. She was thinking about the person she had been waiting for, and about how long she had been waiting for a lot of things, and about whether waiting was the same as living or whether it was the opposite of it. Dwight leaned over to Sal and said under his breath, I'm glad we came Tuesday. Sal nodded once without taking his eyes off the 2 men at the end of the bar. Rosa was washing a glass she had already washed twice. She did this when she needed to do something with her hands. She had worked this bar for 19 years, and she had seen fights and confessions and marriage proposals and breakdowns and miracles of various small sizes. But she had not seen anything quite like this. She thought about her late husband Ernesto, who had died 4 years ago, and how she still set 2 coffee cups out some mornings before catching herself, and how she had always thought that grief was something you got over rather than something you learned to carry, and how tonight had changed that thought into something softer and more true. Bryce sat with his drink for a while, and Clint sat with his, and they were quiet together in the way that people can be quiet together only when something real has passed between them. It was the quiet of two people who have found a momentary understanding across a wide gap and are resting in it before the world demands they return to their separate lives. At some point, Bryce said, "Can I ask you something?" Clint said, Sure. All those years, all those roles, all the tough guy stuff, did any of it ever feel real to you? Or was it always just a job?" Clint considered this for a long time, long enough that Bryce almost regretted asking. And then Clint said, "The best moments never felt like a job. The best moments felt like I was trying to say something true about what it costs to be a person, to keep going, to do the right thing when it would be easier not to." He paused. Whether that came out real enough for anyone else was never up to me. Bryce absorbed this. "Marcus used to watch your movies," he said. "Old ones. We'd be stuck somewhere waiting, and he'd watch them on his phone. Said he liked how you always looked like you'd already made peace with whatever was coming." Clint said nothing, but his eyes changed just slightly. "I think he liked that because he couldn't quite get there himself," Bryce continued. "None of us could. Making peace with what's coming. It's easier on a screen. It's easier anywhere that isn't real life," Clint agreed. Another silence, but still the good kind. "I'm going to go see her," Bryce said suddenly. "Daisy, Marcus's little girl. I'm going to go." He said it like saying it out loud was the way to make it real. The way to take something from the place of intentions into the place of things that will actually happen. "I've been telling myself I was protecting her by staying away. Protecting her mom. But I was protecting myself." "Probably a mix," Clint said without harshness. "Yeah." Bryce looked down at his hands, big scarred hands that had done hard things. "Yeah, it usually is." He finished his drink. He stood up, and for a moment he was just standing there next to the stool, and he looked taller than he had before, which made no sense and every sense at the same time. He extended his hand and Clint shook it, and the handshake was firm on both sides, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "I meant what I said," Bryce told him, "about being sorry." "I know," Clint said, "and I meant what I said. Go before you're ready." Bryce nodded once, a single slow nod that seemed to carry a great weight of decision in it. And then he walked to the door, and Rosa said good night quietly, and he said good night back. And then he was gone into the fog, and the sound of the ocean was briefly loud. And then the door closed, and he was gone. The bar exhaled. Rosa poured herself a small glass of something and stood there for a moment just breathing. Harold picked up his pencil but did not open his crossword. Terrence leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Penny put her phone in her bag. Mira looked down at her drawing again and then very carefully tore it from the sketchbook and folded it and put it in her pocket. Dwight said to Sal, "You think he'll really go?" Sal was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think he will." Clint sat with his drink a while longer. The bar settled back into its regular sounds, the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar, the faint music from a speaker somewhere, the ocean outside being its vast eternal self. Rosa came over after a while and asked if he wanted another, and he said, "No, thank you, I should head home." She said it was a good night, and he said yes, it was, and he meant it. He put on his jacket and stood, and Rosa said, "Mr. Eastwood," and he looked at her. She hesitated and then said, "That was something." She couldn't find bigger words than that, but she felt like she didn't need them. He gave her a small nod and a look that said he understood what she was trying to say. And then he walked out into the fog. Harold sat for a long time after Clint left, and then he paid his tab, and he put his crossword in his pocket, and he called his son right there in the parking lot of the bar at 10:30 at night. And his son picked up on the second ring, sleepy and surprised, and Harold said, "I know it's late, and I know it's been too long, and I just wanted to hear your voice." And there was a pause, and his son said, "Dad," and then said it again. Just Dad, and that was enough. Terrence drove home that night, and he stopped at a gas station just outside of town, and he sat in his truck for a while, and he let himself feel what he had been avoiding feeling for 30 years about Bobby, And it hurt the way real things hurt, cleanly and honestly. And he felt better for it in a way that he could not have predicted. Penny went home, and she sat down and she wrote out everything she had been feeling about the person she was waiting for. All of it. Ooh, the hope and the exhaustion and the way she kept making herself smaller to fit into someone else's maybe. And then she put the paper away and she slept better than she had in months. Mira went home and she unfolded the drawing from her pocket and she looked at it for a very long time. In the morning, she would begin the painting that would, 14 months later, sell for more money than she had ever seen and hang in the lobby of a veterans support center in San Diego, where thousands of men and women who came back from hard places would walk past it and feel, without knowing why, that they were not alone. Rosa closed the bar at midnight and she walked a few blocks home along the foggy street, and she said out loud to the fog and the night and to Ernesto, "I haven't forgotten." And she felt him near in the way she sometimes did when she stopped working long enough to let herself, and she went to sleep with her hand on the pillow beside her. And 3 weeks later, a man arrived at a small blue house in Virginia with a bunch of wildflowers he had bought at a gas station because he couldn't find a proper flower shop on the way, and his hands were shaking. A woman named Christine opened the door with a small girl on her hip, a little girl with wide dark eyes and her father's chin. The man said, "I'm Bryce. I served with Marcus. I have some things I need to tell you about him, about who he was, and I'm sorry it took me this long to come." But Christine looked at him for a long moment, and then she stepped back and opened the door wider and said, "Come in. Please come in. We've been waiting for you." And Daisy looked at the big man with the wildflowers, and she reached out one small hand and took hold of his finger, the way small children take hold of things they decide to trust, completely and without conditions. And Bryce looked down at that small hand around his finger, and something that had been unfinished for 8 months, a sentence about a truck and a future and a man coming home, found something near an ending. Not a complete ending. Those are rare and maybe not even real, but something near enough to let a person breathe again. In the bar in Carmel, Rosa came in on Wednesday morning to open up, and she found that Mira had left the folded drawing on the counter with a note that said, "Thank you for the good nights." Rosa unfolded it, and she stood there for a long time looking at the two figures at the bar, the old man and the soldier, in the important space between them, and she pinned it up behind the counter where it stayed for years and where every person who sat at that bar and looked at it felt something they could not quite name but did not want to stop feeling. Now here is the thing about that night, the thing that none of those 8 people knew, the piece of the story that only became clear much later. In the weeks after Bryce went to see Christine and Daisy, he started meeting with other veterans in his area, other men and women carrying unfinished sentences and the weight of people they had loved and lost. He rented a room above a hardware store, and he put out a few chairs and a table, and he made terrible coffee, and he said, "Come if you need to talk and stay if you need to be listened to." Some nights just one person came. Some nights 4 or 5. He never advertised. He never named it anything. He just kept showing up. One evening, a young woman came in who had served 2 tours and come back to find that the person she was before she left no longer existed, and the person she was now had no place to stand. She sat down and she said, "I don't even know how to start. And Bryce said someone once told me to go before you're ready, so start there." And she laughed a very small, careful laugh, and then she started. That group would go on to meet every week for years. It would never be famous. It would never make the news. Most of the people who needed it would find it through a whispered network of people who had been there themselves. One person telling another that there was a room above a hardware store where a big quiet man made terrible coffee and listened like he meant it. The ripple moved outward in silence the way the best ripples do. And at the center of all of it, at the very beginning of the chain that made all of it possible, was a Tuesday night in a foggy bar in Carmel, where an old man said 4 words to a soldier who was drowning, and those 4 words were, "Tell me his name." That was the whole fight. That was what those 8 people witnessed. Not fists, not bravado, not the collision of 2 kinds of toughness. They witnessed the hardest thing there is, which is one person refusing to let another person disappear into their own pain, and the other person, after a long moment of fighting it, choosing to let themselves be found. Clint Eastwood drove home along the foggy coast road that night, and the ocean was somewhere to his left, invisible in the dark but present, loud and permanent and entirely itself. The way certain true things are always present even when you cannot see them. He had not planned any of what happened. He had gone in for a quiet drink after a long day and a long life, and a Tuesday that felt like it needed ending, simply and quietly. He had not gone in to save anyone or to prove anything or to be anything other than a man sitting at a bar. But he was who he was, and who he was had been shaped by a lifetime of paying attention to people, of watching faces and understanding what they said and what they didn't say, of listening to the thing under the thing. And when a broken man had come to him looking for a fight and found something else instead, Clint had simply offered what he had to offer, which was time and attention and the belief that every person carrying something heavy deserves to have someone ask about it. The fog pressed close against the car windows. The road curved left and right, and Clint followed it easily. The way you follow a road you know so well it has become part of you. He thought about Marcus, a man he had never met and would never meet, a man who had hummed country songs under his breath in dark places to keep his hands from shaking, a man whose daughter had her father's chin and trusted strangers with her whole hand. He thought that this was what the world was made of when you got down to it. Not the big loud things, the small persistent things, a hum, a hand, a sentence that needed finishing. A question asked in the right moment by someone willing to sit still long enough to hear the answer. He turned onto his street. The house was dark and quiet and waited for him the way good houses do. He sat in the car for a moment before going in, just listening to the ocean he couldn't see. Just being an old man in a fog on a Tuesday night who had done something small that might become something large, though he would never know the whole shape of what it became, which was fine, which was exactly fine, because that was how the best things worked. He went inside. He turned on one lamp. He sat down in the good chair by the window, and he picked up a book and he read for a while in the lamplight. An old man at the end of a long day, entirely ordinary, entirely himself, which was the most extraordinary thing of all. The fog moved through Carmel all night long. It moved through the streets and around the bar where Rosa had already locked up and gone home, through the parking lot where Harold had stood calling his son, past the road where Terrence had cried alone in his truck for a friend dead 30 years, through the window glass of the room where Penny slept without dreaming of the door for the first time in months, around the house where Mira was already asleep with paint on her fingers and the folded drawings safe in her jacket pocket on the chair by the bed. And somewhere in Virginia, not yet but coming, a little girl was sleeping with her father's chin and her father's wide dark eyes. Sharia not knowing yet that in the morning she would wake up and the world would still be the world. But one piece of it that had been missing would have been returned, imperfect and late and smelling faintly of gas station wildflowers. But there, finally there, which is sometimes the only word that matters. There. Drop your city in the comments below. We want to know where in the world you are watching from. If you are a true Clint Eastwood fan, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story like this today, and subscribe so you never miss another one. We will see you in the next one.